I've never told anyone this story before. I know they probably wouldn't believe me anyway, but I figure if I share it online anonymously, at least I won't be ridiculed or judged. When I was a teenager, about 13 years old, I was staying at my uncle's farm in Neverbrook. Uncle Cryptor was a fat, creepy old bastard who turned out years later to be exposed as a child molester. But there you go. No one knew back then. I could always tell there was something a little bit wrong with him. He lived with his mother until he was in his 40s, until one day she helped him to buy the farm with her savings. He never married and had a creepy affection towards children. I remember he used to always buy us paddle pop ice creams when me and my sister visited as kids. When you stayed at his farm, it was a different story. You had to live like him. The only food he ate was canned spam and roll your own tobacco. The house was cramped and small, no books, no television, hardly any furniture. My parents had gone away for the school holidays, and they dumped me there that summer, and I'd never forgiven them for it. The farmhouse always stunk like stale tobacco and mildew, and I made sure to make myself scarce to avoid Uncle Cryptor's weird conversations. To kill the time, I used to go for these long bushwalks and listen to mixtapes on my Sony Walkman. The songs were all recorded from the radio because that's all you had back then. There was no iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube. I can still remember every recorded soundbite, the commercials, the DJ's intro and outro. I can even remember the name of the mixtape I was listening to, that Night Starry Heart Attack mix. It was written in red texta, and the cassette cover had pictures of Christina Applegate on it, my first wet dream crush. Anyway, I'd been out in the bush one day around dusk when I'd seen this airplane go down. It was a small jumbo, not a light plane, domestic size. I turned up to look at the sky and see what the noise was, because even with my headphones in, the low-flying engine was rattling through my brain. The plane flew overhead, couldn't be more than 100 meters high, and it just kept dropping. And the next thing, there was this incredible crash sound as the plane skidded through the national park. I remember feeling this mix of emotions: anger, excitement, guilt, and fear. But I had thought to myself, what if some of the passengers were still alive? I could help them. I knew the plane couldn't have come down more than a kilometer away, and so I just began sprinting through the woods. I still had my headphones in my ears, and I can remember so clearly the song playing was A Forest by the Cure. That weird, mesmerizing synthetic beat, like a soundtrack to this horrible event. My heart was racing in my chest, and the trees blurred past like demonic totem poles. I kept seeing strange shadows in the darkness, the scared imagination of a teen playing tricks on the brain. I also imagined this kind of glowing orb shape hovering just ahead of me. I must have run for over half an hour. I remember I was sweating when I finally reached the clearing. The vivid recollection of the horror still pierces me, a broken crystal shard in my memory. The jumbo had taken out about a 15-meter radius of bushland. There was debris and broken branches surrounding me. I could see the broken tail wing laying on the dirt with the Dingo Airlines logo in maroon. The body had been torn in half, and each part had swung in opposite directions. There were still some spot fires burning around the scorched foliage. Through a stack of wing spoilers and rudders, I could see more of the fuselage than I desired to see. About the midway point, where the plane was torn in half, my eyes tracked straight into the passenger cabins. The seating was torn up, and unused airbags, breathing apparatus, and life vests dangled limply from the ceiling. Some of the passengers still sat like crash test dummies in their seat, pale, dumbfounded facial expressions, bulging eyes, but even the intact corpses looked deader than any body I'd seen in films or books. The other 70% weren't so lucky. They were either disemboweled or some vital limb or even their head severed, little mounds of entrails on the floor. These were the only distraction from the carpet of blood and fevered splatters of vermilion on the ceiling. For some reason, I'd walked into the cabin just to assure myself this was really happening. Half in shock, half spellbound by the visceral grotesqueness, I had stared at some of the corpses for what must have been a disturbingly long time in retrospect. I kind of lost all sense of reality, looking at the businessman with shattered glasses and black tie strung over his face, nursing his gouged abdomen in his bone-cold hands, and the woman cuddling her young daughter, both petrified in a permanent screaming expression, frozen stiff with rigor mortis. The guy next to them had burnt up to little more than a charred skeleton, taking half the chair with him. My God, the gristle and bone. It had been hours before I got back to the farm, and I remember going straight to bed, sinking deep into nightmares of recall, all the unhallowed carnage I had just witnessed. I certainly didn't want to engage a conversation with creepy Uncle Cryptor after an experience like that. Besides, once I'd seen the entire flight were dead, there seemed little point alerting the authorities. Other people would have reported the crash, and they'd find the plane soon enough. It was a rough sleep on a hard, dirty yellow pillow. Weeks later, back at school, I tried to tell other people my story, but everyone thought I was telling a tall tale. First-year high school students weren't prone to being completely honest, so I guess I can't blame anyone. All those made-up stories of bravado, sexual conquests, and sporting feats. That might have been the whole story, just a bout of PTSD from witnessing something tragic a kid was never meant to see at that age. But there were two things which never quite left me about that incident. Memories which would stick with me till adulthood, and finally result in the total collapse of my sanity in the past year. After repeat incidents of psychotic episodes relating to this trauma, I was finally hospitalized to Berkeley Institution in 2017. One of the weird things was, I never heard another goddamn thing about that airline flight. The flight number, news about the crash, not one thing. Now, I was young, and it's not like I watched the news or anything anyway. Hell, maybe deep down, I just wanted to forget the whole thing. Wipe it completely from my brain. Maybe I ignored the media even more, just to stay safe. The other thing was this reoccurring memory, or nightmare. I was never sure which. The whole episode had been such an emotional blur, such a fog of terror and bewilderment. It was always difficult to discern what I saw as memory and what I just reimagined in my later nightmares. Still, this memory clip played back so many times and kept resurfacing over and over in my teens and 20s. When I was walking through the cabin, I'd seen this kind of impossible space up the back of the plane. I'd been kind of hypnotized, almost somnambulistic, and stepped up through the bloody hall. Then I remember the vectors being all wrong, and the angles being too obtuse. There was this whole room out the side, where there couldn't really be anything, a folding tunnel of warped metallic space. Then I'd turned and stared into the darkness and seen this man. The man might not have been menacing himself if it wasn't for his luminosity. He seemed to be levitating, and there was some preposterous machine where his head ought to be. There were these kind of neon wires running into the surrounding mechanics, and the last thing this glowing man had said something to me in a booming, reverberating vocal. I don't know what he said to me, and in the dream, I always wake up in a cold sweat right when the voice speaks. 20 years later, and the nightmares and memories had almost abated. I was a regular adult, married with a baby on the way. Up until a year or so ago, you certainly wouldn't have described me as someone with mental problems. I've always been fairly functional, social, even jovial. I host a film club every week with a group of 7 close mates. Still manage to get out on the weekends and get to concerts and day classes. My life outside work was active and fulfilling. I worked in the technology sector for a big internet multimedia company, but I can't disclose their name. One of their new warehouses opened in Moonsmoth in 2012, and I worked there cataloging data, mainly programming and occasionally tinkering with hardware. It had never been an exciting industry before that terrible month. Certainly not distressing. Things all started to go wrong in March. I'd been down near Port Phillip Bay, Hexton, going for a walk along Beacom Street. Then, out of the blue, I'd witnessed this head-on collision. A small green sedan just went straight through a red light, then just annihilated the red Honda traveling against it, pushing it up over the sidewalk. Shards of glass scattered over the road like a carpet of diamonds. I know what you're thinking. Witnessing another accident triggered the PTSD from the wreckage I'd seen when I was younger. Thanks, doctor. But yes, that's probably a pretty good diagnosis. So maybe what I'd seen that day was nothing more than a hallucination brought on by brain trauma. But looking back on it, the physical reality of it, it's so clear to me. I dashed over the road to see if the drivers were okay, held up my hand to my face, and almost gagged when I saw the broken glass and the mangled head, splattered brains. The poor girl in the passenger seat, with her face slashed open and one eyeball dangling from fetid, wet, bloody sinew and bone beneath. I'd vomited a little bit in my hand and crouched down on the asphalt, struggling to breathe. Then I had this agoraphobic feeling, and the marvel had occurred to me. I had been staring at the relative position of the tire in the crumpled Honda, but it wasn't there. Nothing was quite like it should be, as if something had gone wrong with the geometry of the space around me. There was this kind of cavity in our dimension, and this dank-looking tunnel which stretched out into darkness. Right in the middle of the road, the entrance sitting impossibly in the air. And by complete hypnotic powerlessness, I just started to crawl through the non-existent space, across hands and knees, my elbows touching the wet surface of the metal floor. I crawled and crawled until my vision reached this point, and I was suddenly looking down at this horrible, enormous pair of chalky white feet. Terror overtook me, but as I was completely powerless, I didn't make any sudden movement. For 30 seconds or more, I stood staring at the gnarled white feet. They were almost like a giant's feet, very bony and weathered with scars, and the texture of the pale skin was horribly rough, like paper mache. I didn't have to look up. I knew I was back in the dimension of wreckage, and that this was the man from my dream. Mr. Flesh Cyborg. That was the name that came into my head. I think that was his name somehow. Suddenly I became so afraid of what he would do to me. I turned around and began to run back through the strange vent, never looking back at the horrible owner of those terrible white feet. IEP. The next thing that happened to me was at work. I tried to explain the experiences to my wife, but she just grew pensive when I mentioned anything, saying I sounded like a crazy person. I definitely knew better than mentioning anything to my colleagues at work. I wasn't particularly close to anyone at the company. We spoke in our lunch breaks, of course, but never about anything not completely artificial. Surface level stuff. Podcasts we were listening to, the latest scandal perpetuated by the media, boating expeditions on the weekend, or how our kids were keeping us up at night. Then, one day, I was downstairs in the warehouse using a forklift. I had made a mistake in the software system, and now we had a room filled with the wrong order. And we were down on staff, so I had to help load the pallets back into the container to be packed for delivery. Then the thing had happened. I was overconfident with the forklift and rammed up against an 8-meter high wall of boxes. The entire framework gave out, and before I knew what was happening, the entire wall came down on me. I couldn't even hear the warehouse workers digging me out from underneath the payload. One of the heavy boxes had hit me straight in the temple, and I think I must have been knocked unconscious. Nonetheless, the experience played out to me in real time, like some terrible, waking nightmare. The moment of impact, I'd felt the space around my ears stretch out, like the software in my brain had been rebooted, and I was seeing behind the operating system. There was a kind of network of polygonal shapes and a spinning silver disc in the middle of a framework of wheels and windows. I must have drifted in and out of consciousness, for the suffocating claustrophobia of being beneath the pile of boxes stayed very present. I felt like I was laying beneath an avalanche of steel slabs, which had fallen from some catastrophe from outer space. Then, I had began to crawl through a dark cavity towards an open area bathed in light. Coming into the light, I could see I was within a futuristic kind of tapered dome, engraved with strange alien metallic carvings, intricate metal shells and decorative formations along the ledge, with triangular geometries lined with tracks of glowing light, folding floral arrangements, falling in and out of each other like mechanized water. These were the walls. At the back of the metallic igloo, there was a door covered by black drapery. It all becomes a little bit hazy here, but I distinctly remember pulling back the black curtains and crawling into the darkness. Whatever I saw there, I can't for the life of me remember. My next conscious memory had been waking in the hospital. My stepmother was there, and I had grabbed her arm, ranting and raving about the pale, luminous man and the world of the wreckage. I suppose I had been ranting for a week during my recuperation period, and that was what had triggered the doctors to decide to have my annuled by a psychologist, which in turn resulted in me being admitted to Berkeley Hospital. Actually, the stay for the most part had not been so bad. I was wired to the nines on antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. I remember the two bright lights and constant rattling of the tracks of gurneys down that ominous hallway with the 9-paneled windows. The food was all slop, and most of the other folk in the mess hall were too far gone, on another planet for me to engage with significantly. Sometimes I noticed that items around the place were being moved around without my consent. Windows opened and doors closed as if by invisible personages. Or my knife and fork would disappear. I really thought I was going crazy. The most toxic incident happened during the week that I refused to take my medication. I had begun flushing the pills secretly down the sink, and after about 4 days, I had this bizarre sensation of delirium. In my perceived liberation from the drugs, I was now convinced I was gifted the insight of the real truth about how the entire system worked. I remember manically staring at myself in the oblique, chipped, and silvery mirror in my bedroom. I would hold my arms up in the air, as though on puppet strings, imagining myself to be the toy of some grand entity whose knowledge extended beyond our simplified realm of feudal existence. I would dance and sing strange ancient shanties to myself, made up songs of homage to the days of yore. Then I had started to see fragments of Mr. Flesh Cyborg in the mirror. I punched the mirror with my fist, carving it into a spider web of fragments and drawing deep slits of blood on my knuckles. The entire puzzle of me that I saw there in the broken mirror added in total to a confusion of parts, some mine, some belonging to MFC. Then, one night when my dreams were suspended by night terrors and sleep paralysis, laying in the cold white sheets, FC came for me. He flew into the room like a UFO, floating and glowing. Then he soared over the bed. His incredible long arms dropped down like cranes, and his clawed hands dug into my flesh. He lifted me up, and we flew through the walls, astral traveling through hyper-colored spaces, higher and higher into dark astral caves, made of dripping metalwork and ribbed fleshy pipes. I felt the most bizarre sensation, as though my organic parts, the chemicals in my brain, my arteries and nerves were linked to this factory of external mechanics. Mr. Flesh Cyborg's face took on this horrible shape, like a metal pterodactyl. His claws pressed harder into my flesh until I screamed, and he leaned into my neck, whispering into my ears with death-smelling breath. "One day, all this will be yours," he said. Then he dropped me, and I fell for what felt like years, through layers and layers of metallic, alternate dimensions, eons, centuries, and astral worlds, until at last my soul sunk back into the body lying in my ward at Berkeley Hospital. The next day I woke up and continued taking my medication. Up until this day, I have followed everything the doctors say, taking my medication every day, and I haven't seen MFC since then. I just hope and pray that things stay that way, because I never want to look upon that unhallowed world of sabotage, that wreck of infinity again.